Good morning. It's Patrick Lovell, Truth Bomb riffing the con on Wednesday, February 14th, 2024 at approximately 9:15 a.m. my time. Happy Valentine's Day to all of the lovely people out there that hopefully have the big heart shape, just like Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. Boy, could you imagine the kind of fun they could have on Valentine's Day? Hey, let's go anywhere in the world and do anything we want after winning the Super Bowl. Yeah, I'd kind of like to live that life, but unfortunately, I guess that opportunity has long since passed. The equivalent for me would be to somehow energize, turn on, and galvanize tens of millions of people to understand what it is that I've been bringing you day in and day out for some time by myself and with others. And for those of you who have been discovering this recently, it's interesting. I've been getting these emails from people that are like, wow, I'm just discovering some of these discussions and these interviews that you have. And they're like, wow, mind blowing. And that they are, by the way. And they're like, they have all of these ideas. Why don't you hashtag this? Why don't you get involved with these guys? Why don't you lay up, your information to specific groups? Maybe that would happen because for some reason, many more people need to be listening to you. And I'm like, well, welcome to the party. Help spread the word. Because if you're one of those people, my name is Patrick Lovell. I have been around for a long time, and I've been delivering these truth bombs and these extraordinary revelations for the last year and a half, pretty much nonstop. And I chose to do so after we revealed our unbelievable work that is probably important now, if not more so than ever before. And we released it right during the January 6th insurrection. So we're approaching 3 years in terms of when we revealed the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that never ended, which is a blueprint for everything that's going on. And what's so extraordinarily frustrating at the same time gets more and more clear every single day is the nature of social media, is the nature of mainstream media. On the social media side, to the complete contradiction of everything Elon Musk has projected since he's purchased Twitter, aka X, is this notion that here's a free speech platform where he's not going to put his thumb as the owner, and whatever that means. And I know there's a lot of other people in the scenes that have a lot of influence, including the Saudi government and probably huge hedge funds and whomever helped finance Elon's purchase and however that deal was arranged. In particularly including white right-wing billionaires, the likes that might include the folks that we've heard about their influence in the Supreme Court, the likes of, I'm just assuming here, and I'm thinking the constellation, not so much these people, but the way we've seen it, in the Supreme Court, for example, Harlan Crow, the billionaire real estate developer out of Dallas, and Leonard Leo, hedge fund guy, and so forth. They're like front people for other groups that are involved with something behind the scenes that have their fingers everywhere. I've been tracking, and I don't know if I would call myself an expert, but I definitely know a lot of information about the Koch apparatus and what they've been doing for many years. I got a pretty significant understanding of how the John Birch Society existed back in the 50s and how organized people of wealth have an outsized influence in our society, which of course is antithetical to what the United States is supposed to be. Of course, a country of by and for the people, a country where separation of powers gives equal sort of power to the judiciary, the executive branch, the administrative branch, and all of the balance of powers that's supposed to enact vis-a-vis the integrity of the law. And then media is supposed to be the fourth estate. Media is supposed to work on behalf of a democracy of by and for the people so that we can hold power to account. That's the entire design. It's like this massive engine, this dynamic balance of scenarios to ultimately encourage and ensure a fair playing field, because what we've learned throughout history is that genius happens in every segment of society. And you can't predict where it's going to come from. And you can't predict who are going to make the unbelievable achievements that move society forward both through technology and innovation and a variety of other things that, has in my lifetime created what we once were, which was a superpower. And what we are now is a downward spiral, country in disarray that is on the edge of being a failed state. And many of my sort of shortcuts to try to frame what we're in the midst of is that one, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've all heard that before. What you haven't heard before, which I think is more an accurate description, came from a 17th century libertarian, if you will, philosopher of 17th century France, a guy by the name of Bastiat, who would proclaim that when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify. And all of this is, in essence, what we're seeing. I understand at a level that many people don't understand, because I've spent over a decade in the midst of all of this stuff as a producer and independent journalist, gathering and aggregating the most important information that reveals that, quite frankly, corruption burrs and fuels fascism. We're not a democracy. We're not in a fight to save democracy, even though a lot of people are being sort of galvanized and animated and inspired by that fight against all things MAGA. But we're nowhere near that. And as a result of the 2008 great financial crisis, what we are, and this is an accurate depiction, we're a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism to guarantee what I call the mafiocracy, that is now ultimately creating fascism or fueling fascism and financing fascism. And they've created a complete hostile takeover of all branches of government. The corruption in Congress is insane. Although it's nice to see that George Santos was replaced by a Democrat. And I liked what he had to say last night, that it's like, let's get rid of the people that divide us and let's find people that can work on behalf of the American people. Well, good luck with that. There's too much money being made by billionaire apparatuses that spend billions on the lowest return on investment, which is a corrupt politician, to loot trillions. And that's what I'm revealing to you. And we do that first and foremost through our work, The Con, at www.thecon.tv. And I followed it up because we landed on deaf ears. Look, I've been a producer for a long time. I've been in the business. I know how this whole thing works. I've been at the highest levels. I've sat in rooms and in studios, with some of the most well-known big players in the industry for years. And I've been around the whole thing, and I know the whole process. And we were playing by the rules, and we were represented by one of the top agencies in Hollywood that represents very, very famous people that do similar things that I do, that are all over places like Netflix and HBO and that sort of thing. But we, with this giant story, wasn't able to find the right distribution and penetrate. And I can only speculate as to why that is, but I can also look at the scenario of what it is that I reveal, and it's pretty easy to fill in the blanks of two things. One is we have algorithms. So in my business, if you have a bunch of boxes that you check off, that it's like, okay, this is going to be the subject, this is going to be the talent that narrates it, we're going to have this kind of turn by this time period within the series that's going to go in all of these different directions. And it fits some, kind of a protocol that has been successful in the past. And so that's what gatekeepers are going to approve. But then when they do so, it has to go to a higher and higher and more centralized group of people that make decisions. And what I've revealed in our work ultimately, and this is a lot of what took place in what was intended to be season 2 of The Con, but I ultimately had to do a podcast called The New Untouchables that you can just do a Google search and you can find this information. But I have literally hundreds of hours on the shelf with incredibly important information and thousands of pieces of documentation that prove exactly what I'm telling you, not to mention the whistleblowers at every step of the way that prove corruption in a monumental way, such that, for example, the United States government right now, and for the course of the last year, they were slow to act, but now we're moving this ball forward, but it's probably too little too late, but only time will tell. But we have 91 indictments against Donald Trump, including civil fraud trial and other things that are happening. But in a nutshell, you can frame the entirety of the subject this way: that Donald Trump, as the former president of the United States, defrauded the United States using deceptive acts and practices that included documentation fraud and a scheme to steal the election in the elector certification fraud, but that also, through what we've learned through the criminal fraud exception, involved lying attorneys, which means corrupt attorneys, those that shouldn't be attorneys and in jail, and also corrupt judges. That's a small piece. And by the way, if you go further into the civil fraud trial, which I think Judge Ergeron is going to rule on this week, I mean, there's already been a summary judgment that Donald Trump is guilty of fraud. It's to what extent is going to be the fine that Letitia James, the AG of New York, has requested $270 million. I've seen reports from really good sources that it could be much higher than that, could be closer to $500 million, which would bankrupt Donald Trump. And the entirety of Donald Trump's campaign is to outrun the law, to get into a position to where he just basically rolls over for everything that is antithetical to the United States. But that brings us to the biggest conundrum of all. Because of Donald Trump and MAGA and the blue no matter who and Biden's age and all of these other things, including Gaza and everything in Ukraine, it takes up so much oxygen that the American people cannot see the forest for the trees. They do not understand what everybody intuits, which is, yeah, of course, everything is corrupt, that, you know, the system works for those at the top, but nobody knows the details, which is what I'm providing to you. And what am I providing to you? I'll go into that as I close this truth bomb, but I need to reference last night and the night before, well, it was the night before, Rachel Maddow show. Rachel Maddow came out with this long and sort of, and if you don't know the details of what she's talking about, a very compelling and an emotive sort of framing of players in the history of American fascism that would proclaim certain America First sort of antidotes and other elements that are playing out in MAGA right now, but that would lead to situations back in the 30s through Father Coughlin, who was this radio show giant at the time, who was really on the side of all things Hitler and the Nazis, and others that were in that sort of let's just call it in that universe. And a great movie, by the way, that really captures the essence of this. And it came out right after COVID. And if you really want to kind of get a fictional understanding of this, there was a movie that was directed by David O. Russell, starring Margot Robbie and Christian Bale and David Jefferson. Did I get his name right? He's one of the greatest African-American actors of our time. He was also in Klansman, and he was also in The Rock's television show about the NFL, which will come to me in a minute. But anyway, David Washington, Jefferson, something like that. Maybe I got that in reverse. I got all the names right, but I think I got it in reverse. But the bottom line, the film was called Amsterdam, that touchstones upon this. Yes, there were, for example, Henry Ford and others that were in corporate America and media that were basically playing roulette with America at the time because they liked, you know, Germany's industrialization, but it was also a bulwark against communism. So American capitalists were deeply invested in making sure that they didn't get caught and destroyed by what they at the time were betting that Hitler would win the war. I think they were just more opportunists than they were inclined to the ideology. But therein lies a lot of what Rachel Maddow uses to try to set the table of where we're going, in the sense that, you know, look, if we don't win the election for what is effectively the sort of Wall Street meritocracy educated Democratic Party that are what many in society refer to as elites, a sort of comfort zone, the professional class for over, you know, 3 or 4 decades. And Rachel Maddow is basically the spokesperson for that. I used to think of Rachel Maddow. I remember for years and years, I watched her basically explore a lot of deep-rooted contextualization of corruption, particularly as it relates to Donald Trump and all things the Trump administration. But I found her missing the bigger picture. And I kept thinking to myself and scratching my head, well, wait a second. Why would she be ignoring the much bigger picture while hyper-focusing on all things Trump? Well, it demonstrates exactly what I just said, that the federal government is demonstrating that everything that Donald Trump is guilty of in the 91 indictments and the civil fraud trial and all of the other things that are coming down the pike and all of the different apparatuses, including all of the headaches that are happening in Fani Willis's situation, which is one of the more important cases that exist. Rachel Maddow is a propagandist. She does not tell the truth. And she by no means is a conduit to any sort of perspective other than the manipulation of what she is hired and paid to do, in which she got a bonus or a bump last year to $44 million a year. And maybe that's why she's doing this once a week in the ways that she does on top of her podcast and so forth. But she does reach millions of people, and they're the antithesis. And they found and built over the years, this sort of safe audience zone versus all things that Fox does and all things that CNN does. But what's relevant about what it is that I'm trying to reveal to you is that Rachel Maddow literally gave this treatise, this summation of this interview with Tucker Carlson, who, if you watch my Truth Bombs, I can't stand Tucker Carlson. I think Tucker Carlson is the biggest weasel lizard brain working for everything antithetical to who I am that exists, and that he's sort of like the head constellation to all things Russell Brand, and moving down the chart to guys like Jimmy Dore, people that have been out there and have sizable audiences, and they all work together in their own echo chamber. And I have to throw in, unfortunately, and I hate to say it, Matt Taibbi. And Matt Taibbi just released last night this sort of new investigation series on going back to what he's been talking about for a long time as it relates to Russiagate. And he's giving this sort of specificity on the Steele dossier and how it goes into Clinton and everything else. Meanwhile, he's ignoring what he's actually one of the world's renowned experts in, and that's part of the story as well. So I happened to watch the entirety of and reluctantly, by the way, the entirety of the Trump, sorry, that's kind of funny. That's a little bit of a faux pas. The Putin interview with Tucker. And I did so reluctantly because my colleague, Kevin Howard, who I've been engaged with publicly, and we discuss certain situations that we don't completely see eye to eye on, but he and I see eye to eye on exactly what the real power mechanisms are and the strata of what it is, again, that I'm trying to get your attention so that you understand the reality of what we're in the midst of. And Rachel Maddow, so I took notes and I watched the interview, and I was fascinated by Putin because just the opposite reaction to the interview that Rachel Maddow had. Rachel Maddow first says, look, the first hour of the interview with Putin basically given this, oratory on Russian history is just nobody's interested in it and it has no relevancy. My takeaway was it is completely relevant because it sets the table on exactly why Russia acts the way it does. And whether or not that's excusable or not, it gives perspective and context. And ultimately, throughout the interview, Putin emphasizes over and over and over that it was the Minsk Accords, it was the nature of what Ukraine fits in the context of NATO and what NATO's sort of objectives and agreements are in context to all things what the red line was for the former Soviet Union and Russia and everything that happened post 1991 as Russia actually contracted from what was once the Soviet Union, and ultimately that, to my knowledge, outside of, and I can't even pronounce some of these countries' names, Moldova and Herzegovina, I think, something along those lines, where there was expansion, but there was mostly contraction. And Ukraine isn't necessarily the blueprint for what Rachel Maddow was going to, which fits into this broader contextualization that she started with fascism, and ultimately Father Coughlin, what was happening in the United States because of what the Nazis were involved with, because what her takeaway was that Putin was saying that Poland started World War II because they made it impossible for Hitler not to invade Poland, which is ridiculous, right? And it is ridiculous. And she said that was the ultimate purpose of the interview, was to project that Russia is expanding. Now, I listened to the entire interview, and that's not what he said. He said just the opposite. He said that we don't want to expand, that we're interested in negotiating, and that he laid out the whole situation in Ukraine. But what I took away from the Putin interview that Rachel wouldn't come close to, which is what I've also been trying to get your attention to, is Putin, because of his conflagration as being an intelligence specialist or expert, probably one of the most significant experts in that part of the world, particularly because he was, former KGB before he took over running the Soviet Union, 24 years ago, or maybe slightly longer. I'm not sure if it was 97, 98. But in either case, Putin kept inferring, and he's a sly guy, he kept inferring that, and he never said him by name, but he showed, shall we say, a begrudging respect, because he's an ultimate chess player, for his ultimate competition, who he was inferring is in complete control of the West and the United States, and that's none other than the CIA. And he does so with this sort of embedded sort of the way he interprets it, and I know he does interpret this at a very high level, the nature, the mechanics of Wall Street and our financial system, and the global reserve currency being the dollar, and what that all means, in addition to Western sort of hegemonic geopolitical objectives. And yeah, it was sort of Cold War calculus to a degree, but it was all in this sort of effort, in my opinion, from his point of view, to connect with Americans, which he then, and I think a very callous and a very manipulative and underhanded manner, are trying to connect with MAGA, because he finds them, and again, you have to look at this in the grand scope of the geopolitical chess game between the maneuverings of the CIA and the KGB for now decades. They tend to infiltrate countries where they're trying to create a bulwark between each other, to basically manipulate the populations to have them battle each other, so that they're not looking at the way they're being played by the geopolitical symmetry. And that's how they have control. And then that's how they can get puppets. And both countries are, quite frankly, completely guilty of doing so, whether it's us in our backyard because of the sort of Monroe Doctrine that's extended, for what, like 80, 90, 100 years, whatever, in all things, geopolitical influence that leads to the notion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then everything that happened from that point forward, and Turkey and NATO and everything else. But the whole point of Rachel Maddow was to basically manipulate the interview that I saw, that was a manipulation in its own right, because what I stated in this truth bomb that I recorded recently with Kevin, my point was that I found, initially I had this sort of intuition that Tucker Carlson had some sort of financial connection to Putin. I don't think that anymore. I think he has a connection to some sort of dark, right-wing billionaires, which of course includes Elon Musk, that provided the platform to create, a stir and get, tens of millions of views, or having people watch the whole thing. I like I said in one of my truth bombs recently, I would pay top dollar to see Donald Trump strapped to a chair and forced to watch that entire interview. Donald Trump couldn't do it. Donald Trump couldn't track. Donald Trump is just repeating talking points that I think Putin and the apparatus is giving him, because there's another apparatus behind in the United States that is in this battle with what they refer to as the deep state. What they refer to as the deep state, I interpret as the new robber barons. But these white right-wing billionaires, are to me the new Confederacy. And they're all connected to fossil fuel and military industrial, and quite frankly, finance to a large degree, because a lot of these guys are hedge fund guys or private equity and whatever else. And look, man, if you're looking at these guys, they're all tyrants. It doesn't matter what shape, color, form that you can think of to parallel to history. But the final thing I want to just mention about Rachel Maddow in context of this whole thing is that she kept saying that ultimately Putin is sort of mirroring and expressing his own sort of Hitler ambition. Now, that's a broad-based statement, right? Because Hitler's ambition was to murder all the Jews and the gypsies and the gays and everybody who wasn't, the Aryan model, so that he could enslave the world and, murder everybody else that got in his way. I mean, that was Hitler, until he came up against the Red Army And the Red Army went the distance and lost 20 million people to ultimately crush the Nazis. Yeah, and if it wasn't for them, we would have lost a lot more people or been forced to use nuclear weapons or some variation. I'm sure we would have prevailed, to be quite frank with you, but at the same time, we didn't have to lose nearly the resources that we would have. And because of all of those situations, that's why we became the superpower that we were, because we were basically untouched by World War II, and we rebuilt the world, and that drove our industrialization and everything else until we gave it all away through this paradigm that the CIA ran, which is the other side of neoliberalism. And that's a whole nother truth bomb. But all of these things were unwinding. And my point is that Rachel Maddow just displayed completely, and this isn't to say or suggest that Putin is a good guy and on the right side of history here or anything else. There's a lot that we can discuss about that. It's not even remotely to, there is some credibility for me for Tucker Carlson, because I believe that this is all, once again, absolute manipulation. But I can tell you this, when Putin sends the message that we are top heavy and that he understands the $33 trillion debt is connected to a house of cards and that we're going to about go like this, based on the dollar reserve currency, because all of the BRICS basically have tons of natural resources, and that's the way they're going. And that he's basically predicting to the American people, look, why do you want to stick your nose in our business? That was his whole point. Why do you want to be in a war thousands of miles away when you've got all of these problems at home? And by the way, he sums it up like, look, we are Orthodox Christians. And it was an appeal to MAGA from the standpoint that, look, we want to protect our borders. We're white and we're Christian. And hey, there's more that we have in common that we don't, is the message through Tucker. And then ultimately, I mean, this is just global chess, okay? And hopefully I put that to rest. But the key ingredient that you need to understand is, meanwhile, what he's talking about, what Putin is talking about in terms of top heavy and financialization and 33 trillion in debt and what that's going to do and what that's leading to the BRIC countries is exactly what I've been revealing to you time immemorial, it feels like to me, on a daily basis with these incredible truth bombs, not to mention interviews. I'm going to do one this afternoon with former DOJ white collar director Paul Pelletier, and of course, the greatest criminologist in the history of the world, William K. Black. And we're going to discuss a lot of the issues that we're revealing to reveal, which I've been doing in a lot of these truth bomb interviews recently, is that corporate America and finance have created a hijacking where they have created an alliance with big law, accounting, and all the powers that be to ultimately, if you want to know the truth, create its own bulletproof. So you could call it corporate communism, or you can call it corporate fascism. Like I said at the outset, it's corporate fascism to me, and that's redundant because of the autocracy and what it does, to pump everything up, through the shareholders to the CEO. And ultimately, that's what I've been revealing to you the whole time, is that the CEOs have been puppeteering the entire world through what we call control fraud in the finance. And that's all on display in the blueprint of the con that you can find for free at www.thecon.tv. Why is it free? Because all the American people buy our lies. How many of you have forgotten that it was just probably a year ago, or at least, I don't know, was it last spring or was it last winter, where, Fox admitted that its entire business model is to lie. How do we know that? Because it ran away from the Dominion lawsuit based on the Steele, the big lie, which, of course, if you look at the con, we said that, we were all sold a lie. And I'm convinced that Steve Bannon and company had watched the con and calibrated and manipulated and turned everything upside down and inside out, because that's the formula on that side. Lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. It's all about me. What can I get away with? This is a government of, by, and for Trump through MAGA that all got crushed by the system that are like, look, this other system blew us up, so we're going to go with this guy who's going to blow him up again. Oh, is he going to give us world peace like Jimmy Dore says because he's rooting out Nazis? That was the other side of what Putin was saying. Hey, I'm anti-Nazi, man. I'm trying to get rid of all the Nazis, but I do want to connect with all the white Christian nationalists. They're slightly different. So don't be confused by my rhetoric, because, of course, we lost 20 million people to fighting the Nazis, which they did. And by the way, if you're any of those other sort of ethnic groups in Russia that he said we treat everybody with respect, yeah, I'm sure a lot of them would say, yeah, you guys were just slightly worse or slightly less worse than the Nazis. honestly. I mean, the Red Army was very ruthless. There's no question. You kind of had to be to kill the Nazis, honestly. And they did. And they raped and pillaged Berlin like there is no tomorrow, too. So for all of the white supremacist women out there who think they're untouchable when they try to bury the world, trust me, blowback is a big problem. Listen, guys, or shall I say more misery? And ultimately, that's what I'm trying to reveal to you people. Look, what I have through what I've demonstrated, and I have more and more and more evidence of all of this. And this is what we're trying to do, is to get the information to the American people to understand that you live in a corporate fascist system that is basically looting the world and pillaging everything that we are because they're above the law. There is no law, and it's tyranny. And so we're creating what is a movement to create what we call the Clean New Deal. The Clean New Deal is to take all of the information and the apparatus that I have, which is, it's crazy to say this, okay? Like everything else I said isn't crazy, but this is even more crazy. So the federal government of the United States, between the FBI and the DOJ and the SEC and the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, and other regulatory bodies, I mean, they literally are north of $90 billion a year in their sum total budgets with tens of thousands of employees. The media has tens of thousands of employees if you look at the mainstream media. And none of these entities have told you these truths that I'm revealing to you. I went the distance for 13 years because I asked the right questions to the right people and I figured it out. It was an investigation and I got the evidence and it's bulletproof and it's airtight. And to circle back to a point that I was trying to make earlier, that we didn't get distribution on an HBO or a Netflix in sort of there's a symphony and the cacophony of the media going, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. Because people like Rachel Maddow are paid to make sure you don't know this information. I hate to say it. I've been a subscriber to the New York Times for over a decade. There was a time where the New York Times was my North Star, where everything that came from the New York Times enabled me to understand the world we lived on a day-to-day basis, or at least put it together, until I put all of this other stuff together and I realized what the New York Times didn't do. Why? Because I worked with people from the New York Times. And I understood why they didn't do it. And again, you've got to understand what it is that I am revealing to you. So the 2008 Great Financial Crisis was the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world that had tens of millions of felonies that included hundreds of thousands of players, if not millions, that ultimately were involved with a massive racketeering enterprise that ultimately destroyed the world by everything we show you in the con. The economy of the world, to a position to which the entire apparatus of the global economy that depends on liquidity, because you have to finance businesses, big and small, there was no liquidity because the financial system, and that includes what we call the too big to fail banks, the systemically important financial institutions, and the apparatuses of private equity and hedge funds and asset management, and everybody else were basically fish flopping around on a dry riverbed because they had no money, they had no capital, because they were bankrupt through a fraud enterprise that was so gargantuan that it dwarfs anything that any mob apparatus in the world has ever attempted, whether it was La Cosa Nostra out of Sicily, in all things South American, that everybody's kind of had a second coming because of everybody really got really interested in his life. These things all came from my generation in the 80s. Pablo Escobar. Organized crime has been around forever. The human condition is frailty. We have laws to prevent people from doing certain things, but we all know, and many of us have partaken in things that are illegal because we like it. Whether it was drinking alcohol before prohibition or doing drugs that are illegal and all sorts of sexual misconduct and yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I mean, this is the human condition, right? And so there's always been an underbelly of the world's global economy, and that's the mob. And they're also very ambitious and incredibly organized, which is why we call it organized crime. But they are nothing. They are nothing to the men with suits with no shame, the smartest, the best that come out of the Ivy League, that get a taste of the cocaine, of the heroin, which is money, and a whole lot of money, which is even more of an aphrodisiac than anything else. It's power. And they pulled off the ultimate coup d'etat because they buried the world. They were illiquid. They were bankrupt. But yet, because of the revolving door, because of the systemology, because of the nature of how we've calibrated ourselves over the course of the last really 4 decades, maybe quite longer, we've created this culture of deceit. We've created this culture of betrayal. We've created this culture of it's all about me. I'm going to get mine by any means necessary, and I will do whatever it takes to destroy everybody around me because there's an upside, there's an incentive, there is a hell bent for leather, man. You get to the top and you are untouchable either by the law, and then nothing like markets or anything else can hold you down. There is no such thing as free markets or integrity of the law for those above the law, which means it's tyranny. And what I've revealed to you time immemorial is this fact that nobody, not Rachel Maddow, not the New York Times, not the Wall Street Journal especially, not the Washington Post, not Chicago Sun Tribune, or I'm getting it mixed with Miami, but Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, all the great papers of our country with great resources, they have not told you this story, primarily because hedge funds and billionaires who depend on the system I'm telling you have purchased media, aka Rupert Murdoch. He's like, you know what? We've got $14 billion in profits. I think $4.9 billion in operational revenue for 2022 when they paid $787 million to get out of a suit that could potentially take it all down. That's like small change, which they call cost of doing business. There is no legitimacy anywhere. Everybody is lying to you, but what I am providing to you is the ultimate truth. Because in 2009, the powers that be were able to work because of the revolving door and those who were in control at the Federal Reserve, who met 98 times behind closed doors to come up with this smoke and mirrors deal where Congress supposedly approved $750 billion in funding, where we ended up providing 29 trillion at first, and then it turns out to be 33 trillion. There's 1,000 billion in a trillion. Monumental money of liquidity and loans, and through this entire apparatus of illegality, because all of the financial system had been involved in massive racketeering. And not difficult racketeering, the easiest to prove racketeering that I have ever seen in my life, which is why it's insane that me, Patrick Lovell, had the audacity, the courage, the initiative, and the wherewithal to be able to go find the budget, to be able to go do these things, to prove it, and I put it on all on display. And why aren't I on HBO or Netflix or wherever else? Well, because BlackRock, which if you listen to Russell Brand and Tucker Carlson and others, every once in a while they go into, and Alex Jones, they go into this sort of like, hey, the guys that are the puppeteers that are pulling the world's, why can't I think of the strings? It's BlackRock. And they're right, but they don't understand how. And I'll tell you how. Because Timothy Geithner, the former president of the New York Federal Reserve, whose job it was to prevent everything that happened, of course he didn't, and he fell upwards because Obama puts him in a position to be the Secretary of the Treasury alongside, at the time, Hank Paulson, who told the world that he was going to pull out a bazooka if he needed to. And of course, the former Federal Reserve Chairman who followed Alan Greenspan, who made all of this possible, Bernanke, who ended up getting this is how twisted the world is, a Nobel laureate for his involvement with this, which was basically just to loot from the Federal Reserve the full faith and credit of the United States through Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to provide tens of trillions of dollars to save the rich. Well, everybody else was expendable. Everybody went down the tubes. Tens of millions of people got crushed. Divorces, collateral damage, financial terrorism, homelessness, broken up families, and all of the insanity that's led to this insanity that we're in the midst of. Remember when I said corruption burrs and fuels fascism? Yeah, that's what we're in the midst of. And all these MAGAs who proclaim law and order that are following a complete, like mid-level Don the Con, who's a joke. And his entirety of his system just looks like these pictures I'm seeing on Facebook of these grotesque looking like blonde old women with collagen lips and fake boobs and everything. They're sexy? Dude, that's what they look like in that universe. It's Tammy Faye all over and Jim Baker, which are all liars and weasels and freak artists, con show people, the carnival, which we've had a long history of in the United States. Where do you think we got the Wizard of Oz, by the way? Which is a very similar story that goes back to that generation's version. And so what I'm revealing to you, if you can hear me, if you can share me, if you can spread me, if you can dive into everything that I'm revealing to you, then you will suddenly see how this whole system works. And you will suddenly understand how everybody's getting gamed. And if you don't understand the facts and the evidence of what it is that I'm revealing to you, you're nothing but a tool in the fool circus. And that's what we're trying to fight, and we're trying to overcome. And it's a two-front battle against mainstream deep state, if you want to call it that, and all of those protecting the racket. And yeah, I can understand if I was rich and I had all of my, money and assets and everything else, and all of my stocks and all of my portfolio were going through the roof, that I might not want to, basically upset the apple cart, because it's like, you know what? I didn't break any laws, so I got mine. I don't even think people think of it that way. Brain surgeons are too busy being brain surgeons. Accountants and pilots and everybody else are too busy. But when you have money, you invest money and you want to get your kids in college. That's the American dream. But unfortunately, it exists for the top maybe 10% for sure, 5%, 1% for sure. But we're all skating on thin ice at a time period where we have seen, since 9/11, massive turbulence that leads to massive problems in global turmoil that's been growing and growing ever since. And yeah, based on what we're seeing from NATO, and I dare say Rachel Maddow, it just seems like a proclamation to justify what would be further engagement. And what we're seeing in Gaza and everywhere else, it's like, for me, it's like, we cannot pretend for a second that we're saving democracy or exporting democracy in the year 2024, given all of the problems that I've revealed to you. You're really completely in the dark and hosed if that's what you think. But if you're somebody that goes from that way to Donald Trump, I'll say this to all of the senior people that are MAGAs that I know aren't Nazis, but that are frustrated with this neoliberalism that destroyed your pension and everything else. What I'm telling you is the system that did it. And Donald Trump's not going to change that. He has no interest in changing that. You remember when he said he drained the swamp? He freaking just got rich off the swamp. I still want to know how much money he made during COVID and PPP and all the rest of it with, my God, one of the most straightforward, transparent, corrupt Treasury secretaries of the Treasury, this guy, Steve Mnuchin from Goldman Sachs, who's like, oh my God, his involvement with Saudi and Jared Kushner. Guys, it never ends and it's impossible to keep up. And the reason they're all going for it is he who has the gold makes the rules. And that's what this is all about. It's the same story that's happened over and over and over. To use another sort of common parlance, or let's just say pop culture reference, it's, if you get the Iron Throne, which is the presidency, Congress, and the Supreme Court, you get the Iron Bank. That's not separation of powers. That's not the integrity of law. That's not of, by, and for the people. That's not a country of dignity, decency, and integrity. So we are creating the Clean New Deal to get this information over the noise and the madness of lies, to ultimately hold the power to account, because that's the only way we're going to end this. And we still have a tiny shred of integrity, a tiny shred of the law and people that could actually save this before we go to Armageddon, if only tens of millions of us rise to the moment with the truth. And the way I like to say it is, this is exodus from corruption to create the resurrection of the American dream. And ultimately, yeah, is it Armageddon? Maybe. But is there a truth? Is there a savior? Yeah, the truth is the savior. The truth of how everybody's getting gamed by this incredible system. And so if you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in integrity, decency, integrity, sustainability, and ultimately beauty, if we merge in unity, we can defeat the misery of tyranny, and that's our destiny. And that's what I call the Clean New Deal, to hold the power to account. And there's ways we can do this. And if you listen to all of my truth bombs and you listen to the experts that I bring in all the time, you will understand what we can do and how we can do it. But I've got to demonstrate to the American people that this system has gotten away with north of $70 trillion to the hands of the gatekeepers that control the whole system, based on using the scheming and the geopolitics and ultimately the CIA. And I probably got to be careful, but not really. I'm at this point where I got nothing to lose, and freedom's just another word for nothing less left to lose, because I'm all in, man. I ended up getting a divorce. I lost my, all of the stability of being this sort of upwardly mobile, dynamic guy in doing the American dream. I was a football coach. I'm kind of like the Disney dad. And yet here I am telling the truth. And that's not in a supposedly capitalist country, there's no market for the truth. So it's free. So we made it free. But what we have to do is we've got to galvanize a movement based on the information that we spent millions of dollars to put in front of the American people, that the federal government that gets billions of dollars a year to do in the media, billions of dollars in revenue to make sure you don't understand. There has never been a more heroic freaking attempt to save the United States in the history of the United States that I'm aware of. And I'm not putting it all on me, because I only ask the questions. All of the people that I deal with are the heroes, quite frankly. They're the ones who sacrifice their lives and everything else. But I do have to admit, I'm tenacious and I never give up, especially when I know I'm right. Because when you have the truth, you're bulletproof. And I'll finish with just this last point. What Rachel Maddow's not telling you. So it was one of the biggest eurekas of my life after we released the con, after I had already released the new Untouchables, after I'd understood through the Levy study how we got to 29 trillion and ultimately 33 trillion, how I understood the statutes of the Federal Reserve to know that you don't use the lender of last resort to fuel global racketeering and everything that comes with it, which means that we're all a facade, an empty tiger, a house of cards, and all of the rest of it, which I can't be. Because unlike all of those who hate the Swifties and, Travis Kelce, I believe in the meritocracy. When you're really good and you're the best at what you are, yeah, there should be an upside. That's the way I've always thought about it. But I also believe that there has to be a hybrid situation to where you do your best to protect those that fall through the cracks from very unfortunate circumstances, to give them another chance at redemption. I do believe in that as well. And I believe that we're strong enough, and now that I know how monetary policy and fiscal policy works, to know how you can strike a balance of power and everything else. But we've got to find a presidential candidate to be able to take all of this to the American people, to get to the bully pulpit, to rise at a moment where everything's falling apart, to get inside a situation to basically clean up the madness. If nothing else, but to talk about it day in and day out until we can galvanize tens of millions of people to hold all of our politicians accountable, so that we get rid of all of these guys that are backstabbing us every day, from Matt Gaetz and the entire Republican Party and everybody, on the Democratic side that wants to be the good guy, but of course is playing ball with this meritocracy that has betrayed us all. We need a complete purge, and you have to purge to surge. And so when you understand that it was $70 trillion plus since 2009, do you think we can make the case that we could reboot the entire economy of the United States and the law and everything else, and actually come up with a budget at DOJ where they're going to hold corporate corruption accountable, which is going to free us from the bondage of this misery of slavery, of tyranny? Because that's all it is corruption. And by the way, at the end of the day, corruption is what's destroyed every empire from the beginning of mankind. And corruption has always been with us. Where do you think we come up with the good and evil? Where do you think we come up with the light and the dark? It's corruption. It truly is. The way I framed it is that we've got two columns of our soul. If you've got character and integrity and dignity and decency versus hypocrisy, duplicity, and complicity. Everybody skews a different way depending on what their circumstances are. And when you're an adult with children and you have a house and a mortgage and everything else, you're trying to keep up with the Joneses as best you can. And yeah, maybe people will take shortcuts and go into crypto and do things and take risks that they don't want to do, but they've got to do just to get ahead so that they can actually survive. Because the actual middle class has been suffocated. You're either super rich in this country, or you're pretty much struggling for existence, or you fall through the cracks. Have I made the case yet? Please watch The Con at www.thecon.tv. Watch the new Untouchables. Please watch Patrick Lovell's Truth Bombs the Con on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, and share. Please get this out all over the place. Once you fully understand what we're dealing with and the light bulb goes off in your head, we'd ask you to contribute $13, because we've got to build this tidal wave sort of populist crusade to purge corruption and the fascism it fuels through a modern day Lollapalooza-like tour, to where we go throughout the United States and we take these facts to the American people, winding up on the Washington Mall underneath the gaze of Abraham Lincoln, who once said, "A country of by and for the people shall not perish from this earth." It's up to us to do that. We have to do it now. There is no time to lose. Please. Everything is on the line. If you don't know that, you are completely lost in translation. Rise, roar, revolt. Failure is not an option. This is the clean new deal. When you've got the truth, you're bulletproof. It's not rocket science, it's racketeering. This is the righteous grind. Onwards and upwards.